In today's video, we're going to be conducting a 2019 NHL Draft Lottery simulation where we get to play around and see who might get the first overall pick in the upcoming draft this summer. Plus, in case you're a newer hockey fan or you're not quite clear how it works, we're also going to explain how the NHL Draft Lottery odds work and how the draft order selection is determined. We'll get into all that coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be conducting a 2019 NHL Draft simulation where we can use the computers here through tankathon.com to determine who might actually get the first overall selection. Before we get to the simulation, I want to take a few minutes and just explain how the odds work for the draft lottery so you can see what kind of chances each team actually has to get that #1 overall selection. And I also want to take a few minutes to explain how the actual full draft order selection is determined. First up, let's explain how the draft order is determined. Now I'm going to put up a graphic here on the screen with some key points and talk you through it here. To determine the draft NHL order, all teams missing the playoffs are in the lottery. So that's all 15 teams currently not in the playoffs are involved in the lottery, and they all have a shot at getting that top overall selection. Teams with the least points get more chances of winning the lottery, and as I mentioned, we will look at the odds here momentarily, so stay tuned for that. The first overall pick is awarded by drawing a ping pong ball, so all teams in the lottery have a shot at first overall pick. The second overall pick and third overall pick are also the same, so the top 3 selections are random draw. The remaining lottery teams are all sorted by points, and to fill out picks 4 through 15. Ties are broken by teams' total number of regulation and non-shootout overtime wins, also known as ROW or row, which basically kind of eliminates your shootout victories. And then, if needed, the head-to-head matchup will determine if there's still a tie there to break the tie afterwards. Now, also, playoff teams that did not win their divisions and did not make their conference finals are sorted by points and are assigned the next picks. Playoff teams that won their divisions and did not make the conference finals, sorted by points, are assigned the picks after that. And then the conference finals losers are sorted by points and assigned picks 28 and 29. The Stanley Cup runner-up is given pick number 30, and the current Stanley Cup champion will be given pick number 31. If that process is not clear to you and you have any additional questions about how this all works, certainly leave a comment down below and I will gladly respond to you and explain it further in a different way if necessary to help you understand. Now let's jump over here and take a look at how the NHL Draft Lottery odds work and what are the chances of a team actually winning the Draft Lottery. So obviously, as you can see with the graphic on the screen, the teams with the lower point totals have the greater odds. So the lower you are in the totem pole and the rankings, the greater odds you have of winning the draft lottery, which I think everybody kind of already assumes and understands here. The graphic on the screen is based on the current standings as of today. So if you take a look at the order there, the team that's in the number 31 position only has an 18.5% chance of actually winning the draft lottery. They also have a 16.5% chance of winning the number 2 spot and a 14.4% chance of winning the number 3 selection. Now, of course, the odds are still against them to not win any of those 3 ping pong draws, and so really the best odds of them are actually losing the top 3 and finishing in 4th position. Because the top 3 picks are done by random draw, if you're last overall in the league, the absolute worst position you can be in would be number 4 overall. So taking a look at this graph, you can see here how that all works. And of course, the odds are adjusted accordingly depending on how low you finish. But even if you're team number 15 and you just barely missed the playoffs, you are eligible and do have a shot at that top overall pick. Like, for example, right now, team number 15 would be the Montreal Canadiens. And even though the odds are certainly very, very low, they do have a 1% chance of getting the top pick, a 1.1% chance of getting the number 2 pick, and a 1.2% chance of getting the number 3 pick. So overall, teams 1 through 15 all have a shot at this. But obviously, the lower down you go, the less your odds and less likely you are going to win. Now, as we get closer to the actual draft lottery, which will be conducted after the end of the regular season, usually early on in the playoffs, that's done sometime in April, we can actually take a look at this a little bit further, maybe look at the history as well, and kind of see, historically speaking, which teams have actually won over the years. Again, now that that's all explained, if you have any questions on that part of the process here, leave a comment and I'll do my best to respond to you and explain it a little bit further. The draft simulator I'm using today, again, is through a website called tankathon.com. I will link that in the description, and I'll likely put it in the pinned top top comment on the video here as well. If you've never visited the site before, you can certainly go check it out. It's a very intensive site. They have not only a cool tool to determine the draft order, but there's a lot of information there about prospects as well. And the mock draft I'm completing today is just based off player ranking. It's just not my necessarily my opinion about which player each team should take. I will get into a video like that a little bit closer to the draft once we know the exact order. But for right now, for this mock draft purpose, I'm just going by player rankings here and assuming that the team would take the best player available in the draft. So here is how the draft simulation came out. So as you can see here in my first simulation of the year, the lucky team getting the #1 overall selection was the Detroit Red Wings. And of course, the Detroit Red Wings would probably select with that #1 overall selection, Jack Hughes, who's a U.S.-born top player in this draft. Hands down the #1 overall consensus pick here by all the so-called experts around the NHL and around the international hockey community here. Now, the #2 overall selection ended up going to the Los Angeles Kings, and they would gladly select the big Finnish winger Kappo Kakko. Now, Kakko's also played some center ice this year as well. Hard to say exactly what he's going to be at the NHL level, but even if he is and turn out to be a high-scoring winger or a center, either way, he's a terrific hockey player, and there's absolutely no doubt that he's likely is going to be the '2 selection as well. There seemed to be a bit of a gap between Hughes and Kakko, but then there's another gap again, in my opinion, between Kakko and the rest here. But Kakko, obviously 6'4", 207 pounds, from Finland, having a pretty solid season over in Liga, and would go to the Los Angeles Kings here in this draft selection. The #3 overall selection went to the very lucky Edmonton Oilers. Now, as we know, the Oilers have had a very strong history with very fortunate luck here in the draft lottery. This simulation, they get the #3 selection, and which they would take the very crafty Russian winger Vasily Podkolzin, who I think would be a very, very nice fit with Connor McDavid as the Oilers desperately look for some top-scoring wingers to really help complement those top two lines in their top 6 forward group. Podkolzin, I think, would be a terrific fit, and it would be a very wise selection for the Oilers should they actually be fortunate enough to grab the #3 overall pick. The #4 selection, which belongs to the Ottawa Senators, which would actually end up going to the Colorado Avalanche because of the trade that they had made before with Matt Duchene. And the Avalanche would select the top Canadian-born player in this draft, Dylan Cousins, the center from Lethbridge in the WHL. The big 6'3" center is having a fantastic season here as well, and he would go to the Colorado Avalanche. The #5 overall selection would belong to the Anaheim Ducks, and of course they would select Kirby Dach, center iceman from the Saskatoon Blades in the WHL. The player chosen before him, Kirby Dach, is a big rangy center, 6'4", 185 pounds, having a fantastic season as well. So unlike last year's draft, this year's draft certainly is a lot more deeper at the center position for sure. #6 selection would belong to the New Jersey Devils, and they would take the top-rated defenseman in this draft, and that's Bowen Byram. Byram, another product of the Western Hockey League, which is certainly having a major influence on this draft. It's definitely going to be very WHL heavy here. Is certainly by far the top defenseman, in my opinion, in this draft. And Byram certainly would be a great complement to that blue line with the New Jersey Devils, who has some other promising young defensemen here too as well, like Will Butcher, and certainly could use another top guy in that back end here to help move their team forward. Next up, the #7 selection would belong to the Vancouver Canucks, and they would select left winger of the U.S. National Team Development Program, Matthew Boldy. Now, Boldy is committed to going to Boston College, so he is going to be playing there for at least one season. Most of these U.S. players go into college, end up playing 2 or 3 seasons. Hard to say exactly when he would leave college and sign, but he is certainly one of the higher scoring wingers in the U.S. program, so I do think he'd be a great complement to the already strong group of young forwards in the Canucks organization. The #8 selection would be then belong to the Chicago Blackhawks, and they would grab center iceman Trevor Zegras. Now, Zegras is a player who sometimes gets a little bit overshadowed by Jack Hughes in the U.S. National Team Development Program, but he's really proven this year that he is pretty darn good in his own right, and he's certainly worked his way into many mock drafts into being in a top 10 product here, and very well could still work his way up higher in this draft order before the end of the season. Wouldn't be a complete shocker here, but I think he'd be a great fit in Chicago. And of course, he's committed to going to Boston University here as well, so he likely would be a couple years getting into their lineup. The #9 overall selection would then belong to the New York Rangers, and they would take left winger Peyton Krebs from the Kootenay Ice in the WHL. And of course, it was announced earlier that Kootenay will be relocating here in the near future as well. So Peyton Krebs might be one of the last top players actually selected from that WHL team. Unfortunately, things are not quite working out for the Kootenay Ice. But Peyton Krebs is, even though the team's not doing overly well, Krebs is having himself a solid season, and certainly for an undersized winger, is putting up a ton of points. Again, another product of the Western Hockey League, and I think would be a great fit in the New York Rangers. They're going through a rebuild right now, obviously trying to get younger, faster, more skilled here. The number 10 selection would belong to the Arizona Coyotes, and they would select center iceman Alex Turcotte, yet another strong player from the U.S. National Team Development Program. Turcotte, I think, would be a great fit there. It's a little bit smaller center iceman compared to some of the other bigger names that we saw further up the list here. But at 5'11", this player is committed to going to Wisconsin as well to play with the Badgers. So we'll see. He likely would be a player as well. That likely would be a couple years out from making his NHL debut. At number 11, the Buffalo Sabres would then select Philip Broberg, who's arguably the number 2 defenseman in this draft. Certainly not a defense-heavy draft at all, as we've seen with some drafts where it was, very dominant in one particular position. This is not the year for a top defenseman. Some more of the year for center was a mix in there with some pretty solid wingers as well. But Broberg certainly entered himself into the conversation here. The 6'3" defenseman out of Sweden, I think from most people at least would agree he's the number 2 defenseman in this draft, and would be a great fit and a great compliment to a blue line in Buffalo who's getting better all the time. Of course, they've got Dahlin, they've got Ristolainen. They just traded for Montour. They can throw him in there as well. Then that blue line of Buffalo would be pretty darn solid for many years to come. Next up at number 12, the Florida Panthers will then select Victor Soderstrom, who's also in that conversation for being the second best defenseman in this draft. There's, depending on who you ask, there is a bit of a debate over, is it Soderstrom or is it Broberg? And Soderstrom's certainly working his way into that conversation for sure with his strong play this year. But right now, the website I'm using has him as the 3rd best defenseman. He would go to the Florida Panthers. The 5'11" defenseman out of Sweden certainly very well might be another couple of years, I think, before making his NHL debut. But I think would be a good fit in Florida based on their current defensive situation. Number 13, the Colorado Avalanche, with their own selection, would get another lottery pick with Cam York taken as a defenseman out of the U.S. National Team Development Program. I mean, at one point, Cam York earlier in the year was kind of looked at as being the number 1 or number 2 best defenseman, but I think many people would agree that he's probably been passed here in the draft order by these younger Swedish defensemen here in Broberg and Soderstrom. And York, even though he's having a pretty solid season, actually ends up being the number 4 defenseman taken in the draft, at least at this point in time. That could change, though, again, before we get to the actual draft in June. But York still projects to be a pretty solid defenseman, and likely would be a great complement to an already group of young defensemen that are in Colorado. They've already got guys like Timmins and Makar on their way to Colorado. You throw in another guy like Cam York, that certainly would prove very, very strong long term. Of course, he's committed to Boston College as well, so he very well could be a few years getting there, but that's okay. Colorado can afford to be patient with the already group of young defensemen they have on their way up, so they can all ease them in slowly here over the next few years. Next up, the Philadelphia Flyers at number 14 would select center iceman out of Victoria, Alex Newhook. Now, he's a little bit of a smallish player. He's also committed to Boston College, will be a teammate of Cam York, but he's a very creative, offensively gifted forward, and it's a guy that the Philadelphia Flyers could certainly be patient with. I think the Flyers have a lot of, pretty good forwards right now, so there wouldn't be a lot of room for him to get in and get a bigger role, especially where they got guys like Morgan Frost, who again didn't make the team this year. He'll likely get into their lineup next year, so it'd be a good opportunity for Newhook to kind of hone his craft in college for a couple seasons and work his way into the Flyers lineup here down the road. The number 15 overall selection, we have another fairly big-sized defenseman out of the WHL, Matthew Robertson, going to the Montreal Canadiens. Of course, the Montreal Canadiens used their first rounder last year on Jesperi Kotkaniemi, so that to kind of shore up that center ice position, and I can see them making a good play to take a strong defenseman. Depending on where they end up finishing, they may very well are not guaranteed to be in the lottery. They could work their way back into a playoff position and kind of get pushed down a little bit further into the draft here. But either way, probably would be in their best interest if they're able to, depending on where they pick, to try to get a strong defenseman. So I do think Robertson makes a lot of sense for Montreal, regardless here of ranking. So that is your draft simulation for the 2019 NHL Draft. For today, at least, we will probably do this every once in a while as a standings change and the odds change for every particular team. I will do an updated video like this a few times between now and the actual draft in June. And once the actual draft lottery is completed, we will then work on completing an actual mock draft and base the actual selections on team needs as well as player rankings, and not just base it on player rankings like I did here for today. So we'll take all that into consideration and go a little bit more in depth as we get closer to the draft in June. Like I said, the draft lottery will be completed once the playoffs get underway in April. And then once we have those results, we can start talking a little bit more in depth about what player each team should actually select. So of course, as always, love to hear your comments down below. Let me know what you think of the draft simulation and which team are you hoping for gets lucky enough to win that first overall selection. If you're new to the channel, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up before you go. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.